welcome to the conversation. Great conversation for you guys about how do we end the racist policing and criminal justice system that we have in this country. We're going to bring on Kay Whitlock and Professor Nancy Heitzeg. They wrote a book together called Carceral Con, The Deceptive Terrain of Criminal Justice Reform. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, it's nice to be here.
Yes.
Great to have you. So you talk about a predatory and racist capitalism that provides, that requires a disadvantaged and exploited underclass. Now, I'm going to start with a really broad question. Either one of you can take it. If that's true, and certainly the consequences of it are clear, right? How do we change it? It seems like do we have to change capitalism first in order to fix policing and criminal justice?
No, I think we start to work on simultaneously on multiple fronts, and different groups and organizations, different communities, different movements can work on different parts of it. One of the first things that needs to happen is that people need to know that criminal justice reform is not doing what they think it will do. They hope it will reduce mass incarceration. They hope it will remedy police violence. They hope it will undercut structural racism and structural poverty. It does none of those things. In fact, it expands structural violence, and it expands criminal justice systems of policing, surveillance, and carceral control. So the first thing we begin to do is educate. And our book is particularly written to help people look beyond the massive public relations machine that's behind the bipartisan reform consensus in order to understand this, and in order to understand why you can't evaluate the real impacts of reforms without taking the larger social, economic, and environmental context into account, and that's racial capitalism.
I think it's important to add too, the history of the United States rooted in settler colonialism and slavery, is the foundation of all of this, and certainly criminal legal system, has played a major role in maintaining and reinforcing structural inequality at every level. The prison itself was presented as a reform, and we've got a long history of seeing how, as Kay suggested, that reforms rarely dent the system. They end up expanding it, re-entrenching it, reinforcing, recreating the violence.
So I think on some of the issues, there's not much controversy, at least with our audience. Our reform movements, we acknowledge, as you all write about, are generally meant to actually do the opposite. They increase the budgets of the police, and that's the one that's currently being contemplated by Congress in their nonsense bipartisan approach. The Republicans are never going to agree to real criminal justice reform. If they agree to it, almost by definition, it means it's going to actually help the cops and do what they're already doing, which we're not in favor of, which has led to the problems that we're having now. Joe Biden says the same thing. He says we should increase funding to the police, not the opposite. So we know all of those problems. I'm interested because you guys have intriguing solutions for what should we do instead. And there, I don't know that I agree, but I'm fascinated by it. So let me throw it out again to both of you. If we don't have prisons, what would we do instead?
The first thing we start to do is to mount strong cross-movement, cross-constituency, cross-movement campaigns to change the fiscal and social and political priorities of this country. That's actually a possibility. Nothing's an easy task, but it's actually a possibility if we start to think about, and one of the things our book does is really give very strong education in terms of how every problem created by racial capitalism becomes a site for policing and a site for expansion of the system. As more and more people understand that, they become much more open, and they're seeing lots of evidence in lots of areas, not only reform of the criminal legal system, how cosmetic reforms really are not providing any justice pretty much to anyone. So we start by understanding that abolition is a call to develop new, more trustworthy and structurally just social, political, economic, and ecological relationships. And we work at the local level, we work at county and state levels to help organize and build power and develop power, in this case, from the bottom up, from the grassroots up.
Part of what I
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Do you envision a situation where even in a local community, we could get to a place, if we've done all of this right, where we wouldn't have prisons or police? And if that's the case, what would we have instead?
We would have. Well, I mean, there's not. One of the things abolitionists would say is, that there's not one easy cookie cutter answer, right? That we, make the road by walking. That a new vision of public safety and community will be our joint creation, right? One of the things that I wanted to add to Kay's comment is part of what we need to do is, and part of what I think the book hopes to do, is disentangle our notions of public safety from the idea of policing and criminal legal systems. I'm in Minneapolis right now where there's a ballot measure we're gonna finally be able to vote on after a lot of controversy about creating a department of public safety versus just a police department, and then imagining how we can use some of our resources, some of our collective resources, to find alternatives to police responses to, everything. Criminalization of poverty, criminalization of protest, criminalization of a variety of mental health issues. So there's not an easy answer. People have collectively and creatively been trying to, work imaginatively towards envisioning alternatives that are rooted in community.
Real quick, Professor Heitzeg, are you in favor of that ballot measure? It's probably not as structural a reform or change as you would want, but is it a good step forward?
I think it absolutely is. I think it absolutely is. It begins to create some alternatives to responding to a variety of social problems, in the city, in ways that are not criminalizing. So yes, yes for Minneapolis.
Okay.
And the key with all of these issues is to articulate our longer, deeper goal and to invite more and more people into the process of creating different community conditions, different forms of community accountabilities. There is never going to be just a one size fits all solution, but there's an enormous amount of creativity going along there, and we build as we go. But it's a process of having to dismantle on one hand, meaning to reduce the amount of contact people have with police through defunding police, through shifting priorities on one hand, and then lifting up, as Nancy said, these new visions of community safety that are really built in visions of community and ecological well-being.
So Kay, let me stay with you for a second. So you often talk in the book about capitalism and how that's the root of some of these problems. So I understand some of the specifics. So for example, criminal justice, so-called criminal justice in the South started with slave patrols. So, and it has morphed into putting African Americans in bondage in other ways. And so that's clear. But does it have to be that way? Do you think capitalism by definition has to be racist? Obviously every country is different and it has had different histories. So I'm curious why, if so, why? Why do you think it has to be racist?
Well, as the great carceral geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. The almost complete meshing of race and class in this country, and the way that also intersects then with gender and ableism and so forth, is how the system operates. we don't see in the book a gentler, kinder form of racial capitalism. We have to remember too that police forces developed not only out of slave patrols, but also in the Northeast, for example, out of attempts to control labor and to control organizing for labor rights. So there are a number of, and then there's the whole experience of settler colonialism and the policing of indigenous communities. So there are multiple strands and threads, and bringing these realities and these voices in different communities into the process of working to look toward a different kind of society and a different kind of system of justice that doesn't start with processes of criminalization of vulnerable and marginalized communities. That's a big start. And more people are really ready to start becoming a part of that effort.
Right. There's a lot of nuance there in terms of what's called capitalism, the different histories of the different countries, et cetera. But unfortunately, we're out of time. But it's a really interesting book. Kay Whitlock, Nancy Heitzeg, the book Carceral Con, The Deceptive Terrain of Criminal Justice Reform. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.